Streaming and recording has been started.
Good evening, our viewers. Welcome to the 25th episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, a feature of Council for Strategic Affairs. Today is Wednesday, May the 1st, the May Day, and it is 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have a very distinguished guest whom we are featuring today, and you'll be seeing her. She is Miss Cleo Paskall. Cleo Paskall is a non-resident senior fellow at the Indo-Pacific for the Indo-Pacific at FDD, Washington, D.C. FDD stands for Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She has been also affiliated in the past with the Chatham House in London, UK. She has testified before the US Congress. She lectures, she moderates for training seminars for the US military. She has taught at defense colleges in India, United States, UK, Canada, and Oman. She's an author, she is a journalist, and she is a strategic analyst. She is very widely published in the academic and popular press and has written for The Diplomat, Defense News, The Telegraph, Japan Times, The Word Today, International Affairs. And I'm very proud to say that she is a columnist also for the Sunday Guardian that is published from New Delhi. And I share a common attribute that sometimes I also get published there. Ms. Paskall is also senior fellow at Usana's Foundation in India and serves on the International Board of Advisors for the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies and the GCTC, Global Counter-Terrorism Council for India. And welcome to Ms. Cleo Paskall. And the topic for today's conversation is very interesting. It is China's maritime hegemony in the South Pacific. Now, most of our viewers are aware of what China is doing in the South China Sea or Japan Sea or the West Philippine Sea, but very few people are aware of creeping Chinese influence and footprint in the South Pacific. And I could see no other person than Ms. Cleo Paskall, who knows that region of the world very well. She writes very regularly on the issues of PIF and other related issues. So I'm not going to waste your time by blabbering myself, and I'm going to bring you to the expert herself. So Cleo, tell our viewers, what is your impression about China's creeping maritime hegemony in South Pacific?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I've learned a lot from your previous shows. So I'm a little nervous, but I'll get through this. You mentioned Chinese activity in all of those locations just off of its coast. It's if you're standing on the Chinese coast and you're looking out, you're hemmed in by a chain of islands, by Japan, then Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia. So that's why you're seeing a lot of the activity between the Chinese mainland and that what we call first chain of islands, right in there. But the goal is to break out of that chain, either by taking Taiwan or intimidating the Philippines. And as you know very well, the Chinese maps include not only large sections of India, but sections of the Japanese islands, of course, Taiwan, parts of the Philippines. And once it kind of what we've traditionally thought of as break out of that island chain, then they'll start to spread out. But what they've actually done through political warfare, through elite capture, infrastructure, is jump over the chain and start building up influence and assets outside the first island chain and even the second island chain into large sections of the Pacific Islands. And so they're going to be in a position, I think they think, especially once they break through, whether it's Taiwan or Philippines, to start squeezing from both sides. And if they do break through, then to have that spread will be complete. Now, we know that the PLA studies in great detail the Pacific War of World War II, the Pacific battlefield. And these islands were critical. Over 100,000 Americans died trying to push the Japanese back across the Pacific Islands. And so if you know your World War II history, you'll know all of these names. Today, as it happens, at this very moment during our show, it's possible that the new Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands will be announced. Solomon Islands is the location of the Battle of Guadalcanal. That was a very pivotal battle. And then from there, the Americans moved up and across. But the contest today between these two prime ministerial candidates is one of them is from a party that is very close to China. One of the members of the party, the previous Prime Minister Sogavare, actually signed a security deal with China that allows for the PLA to deploy troops in the Solomon Islands to protect Chinese citizens and business interests and to put down dissent. He isn't running for the prime minister position, but he's still in the party. And if his coalition wins, he's likely to have a ministerial post. And the person who is running is his foreign minister, who is the one that was around when that security deal was signed and who is a point person for the negotiations with China.
So, Cleo, let me just interrupt here.
Please.
Isn't it obvious that Solomon Islands is de facto a Chinese overseas base now?
So, well, that's not what this is. The Solomon Islands is a very important case study. I mean, it's also a tragedy for the people of the Solomon Islands, obviously, but it has a lot of relevance for situations like the Maldives. So, I think that there were periods where it looked like the Maldives were going to China, and then India fought back. Gave people who didn't want to be a Chinese outpost in the Maldives some hope and some options. And obviously, the situation isn't great now, but I don't think that either the people in Maldives who like democracy or India is going to give up on the Maldives. Similarly, I don't think we should give up on the Solomon Islands. The voters of the Solomon Islands unequivocally voted for change. They kicked out about half of the members of parliament who were with this pro-Chinese party. And it's the way the system works, because there are a lot of independents and multiple political parties. The 50 were voted in, and now they're putting together coalitions to see who the prime minister will be. So it's not like in India where you know who the head of the party is, and it's a bit more complicated because their political party system isn't as rigid. And 10 out, or at least 10 out of the 50 came in as independents. So we know what the people wanted, and we're about to find out what those 50 will decide. But even then, even if the pro-Chinese government comes in, it's not over. We're going to find out whether the court system has been corrupted, because there'll certainly be challenges. We're going to find out whether there's a free press, because they're going to try to report on it. There are provincial members of parliament, from the provinces, that are also fighting, and we'll know more about them later on in the month. So we know what China wants. China wants, as you said, to set it up as a de facto forward operating location. They're putting in the Huawei towers. They're building the port. But the people of the Solomons don't want that. And we'll see whether the international community truly believes in accountability, transparency, human rights, rule of law, and a free and open Indo-Pacific, and are willing to help the people of the Solomons get all of that and more.
So in contrast to China's creeping influence, which also included possibly using money on 39 of Solomon Islands' previous MPs to buy their loyalty and extending the term of the parliament and extending the election date by at least a year. China has been very systematic in that end. You have written about the confused response of United States.
Yes.
You have talked about the cancelled summit of May 11th, I believe, the COFA.
So there are a few different things there. There's but what you I'll take them in turn, because you've said several important things. And one of them is that yes, Sogavari, the then Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, used a Chinese slush fund to pay off 39 out of the 59 MPs. And that was enough to change the constitution. And later on, they did change the constitution so that they could postpone elections by a year. Now, what that tells me is that the Chinese didn't think that they had enough control over the election process to do it within the normal 4-year time frame, right? So they bought themselves time to put more systems in place. And clearly they didn't quite succeed because they didn't get the immediate win that they wanted. Now they're going to have to fight it in a different way. But what that also tells you is how much the Chinese are scared of democracy. You know, they really they can't abide it, and the goal is going to be to destroy it. So if anybody is thinking that, you know, the West unquestionably has a lot of problems and has done a lot of terrible things. And in this case, they're really failing when it comes to supporting the people of the Solomon Islands. But we see what the goal of China is going to be, which is to get rid of democracy completely. And that's not what the Solomon Islanders want. So that's one thing, is yes, this delay of the election was it helps you understand the Chinese Communist Party mindset, very helpful. The second thing is the failure of the U.S. And the U.S., this whole region, there are, broadly speaking, say, two separate parts of the Pacific. And the Pacific is it's 1/5 of the planet. It's huge. And the idea that we sort of say the Pacific Islands and think they're all the same obviously makes no sense. It's like saying, you know, all of Africa is the same or something. You know, they're very large differences. And broadly speaking, the southern part below the equator, the South Pacific, actual South Pacific, after the end of the Cold War, the US and others, including the UK, had a kind of end of history moment and withdrew and delegated almost, I mean, quite overtly, strategic oversight to Australia and New Zealand, which, you know, is a not ideal, barely post-colonial way of looking at a region. And both Australia and New Zealand were colonial powers in the neighborhood, and have very complicated and often not positive interactions in the region. Some are fine, and there's a lot of familial collaboration as well, but some isn't. But the U.S. very much relies, still to this day, State Department, I would say, relies a lot on Australia and New Zealand for advice in that part of the Pacific. So if you look at Solomon Islands, the U.S. obviously realized there was a problem and has opened an embassy, but it's very small and it doesn't offer consular services. And there's still a lot of reliance on Australia. The north of the equator, the Central Pacific, that area, that the U.S. is much more directly involved. So it's worth sort of making that distinction. We're talking now about the South Pacific. And in the South Pacific, the major Western, up until now, although it's clear that it's not working, powers have been Australia and to a certain degree, New Zealand. And sir, the money that the Chinese have been spreading around in places like Solomon Islands often ends up in Australian or New Zealand banks or real estates or things like that. And it's clearly disproportionate to the amount that a local politician would make. And, if the Australians or New Zealanders truly wanted to help the people of the region and promote democracy in the region, they would have gone after that dirty money years ago. And that dirty money is what allows the Chinese to take hold. So they haven't been in that situation. The simple fact of not going after the dirty money makes it very difficult for honest politicians in these places to compete, but also even to justify. You'd have to be, people can say you'd have to be stupid not to take the Chinese money. There's no cost to it. You don't end up losing the money. You end up with more power. There's no downside to taking the Chinese money. So until that cost benefit analysis changes, it's going to make it very hard for honest people in the region and beyond.
So while all this is happening, there was this conference with the 3 island nations in Washington, D.C. plan, Compact of Free Association, COFA,
Yes.
that you've written about.
Yes.
And all 3 decided not to show up.
Right. So it's unfortunate. So now we're shifting to a different geography. Now we're shifting to north of the equator.
Yeah.
And north of the equator, there are 3 countries, independent countries, called Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, that with their exclusive economic zones cover as much of the Central Pacific as the continental United States. If you superimposed mainland US over the Central Pacific, that's how big this area is. And they're independent countries, but they have, as you mentioned, these compacts of free association with the US, which gives the US very extensive defense and security rights and responsibilities, including strategic denial. So the US can block any other military from operating in that region. And that's what allows the US to deploy from Hawaii, where Indo-PACOM is headquartered, all the way across to the treaty allies of Philippines, Japan, and to reach Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which are part of the United States. So it is this agreement is what underpins U.S. defense architecture in the Indo-Pacific. You hear a lot of, will the U.S. defend Japan? Will it back Taiwan? All of those are secondary questions to, can it get across the Pacific safely? And the reason it can get across the Pacific safely now is because of those compacts of free association with those 3 countries. And parts of those agreements are up for renewal on 20-year cycles, and they were delayed. 2 of the 3 actually expired in 2023. They were delayed. There were a lot of complications, and this is one thing I'll say. U.S. Congress is a total disaster now, except for the COFAs, the Compacts of Free Association, which I testified before Congress on this a couple times, and so I saw a little bit how it worked. On this topic, both in the House and in the Senate, both with the Democrats and with the Republicans, there was unanimous desire to get it passed. And I'd never really seen that sort of a process before, but the staffers, the people who staff those congressional offices, worked incredibly hard across party lines, across both houses, and they got it passed. Now, the deal, and it got passed, it got signed into law by the president in March and in the other 3 countries as well. I mean, it all finished in March. The problem was that there are subsidiary deals that support those. And in the case of 2 of the 3 countries, those deals aren't finished yet. And so there was supposed to be an event. They were supposed to come to Washington and possibly meet the president of US, possibly not. But they've decided not to come. That was supposed to be on May 9th because it's not fully finished yet. So to me, that's an indication that maybe there's at some level in the US government, they're not really in touch with what's going on in these continuing negotiations, and they announced something before they had actually checked with some of the key people. So they're not coming now. Hopefully they'll come later. But the problem with that sign is that it means that all of the attention and effort that went into passing the compacts may have dissipated to a certain degree, and there isn't as much attention being paid to the follow-up, and that's where China's going to sit and wait. They're going to wait for people to stop paying attention and for there to be little irritants that they can blow up into big irritants. And I hope that a lesson is learned from this and the situation changes.
So that brings me to my next issue that I want to discuss with you. Lai Ching-te was elected in January or February as the new president-elect of Taiwan.
Mhm.
And within 2 days of his election victory, Nauru changed recognition from Taiwan to PRC.
Yes.
What does that reflect?
So Nauru is it's an interesting case. So Nauru is an independent country. It's just one island. It has a population of less than actually 10,000 people. It's had a really terrible colonial history. It was it's a phosphate island, and it was mined rapaciously by the British and Australians, and you know, and they've done their best. I mean, they really they've tried. And I want to give you a little bit of the lead up to that decision from a Nauruan perspective. They're located in a position where it made sense for them to transform their port into a transshipment hub, you know, to reach the other islands. And they're already a kind of a central point for an airline. They have an airline that does the region. And that the development of that port, redevelopment of the port, went to ADB. And ADB gave it to now this is, remember, at this point Nauru was a country that recognized Taiwan. They gave the contract to a Chinese company. So of course the Chinese company had a vested interest in not having Nauru develop economically, but to keep a squeeze on it so that it became more desperate and would eventually, you know, there were a lot of other factors as well, but that's an indication of, you know, where China would try to apply pressure. Similarly, you know, I spoke to somebody in Nauru last summer, and they were saying, look, all we want is drones. We can't even patrol our waters, you know. And again, the Australians weren't helping them with basic security stuff and things. So they didn't have a ton of choices. I think that if they had just been given a little bit of help, and this is where, you know, where India could change things completely. And I'd like to ask you about that after, but I'll finish the Nauru story. Yes, 10,000 people. They don't need a lot. And they they're family oriented and democratic, and they just need an option other than neglect or mismanagement by the West, or colonial oversight from China. And it's exactly what we saw with India with the G20. How so many countries were flocking to India, um, with the hope that maybe there's another option. And these Pacific Islands are very much like that. That's why the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Papua New Guinea in almost a year ago now was so well received. So just to say that they flipped. Now, in terms of the timing, I always what I try to do is think of the counter narrative. So let's say China's preferred candidate would have won in the Taiwan election, and 2 days later, Nauru would have switched to China. So it, that's also a good narrative for them. That's a look. Everybody's switching towards China. Why don't you? Now, if their preferred candidate doesn't win and they switch, it's also a good narrative for China. So I think that they deliberately kept it till after the election, but in terms of narrative, uh, either way, it was going to be helpful for Beijing, the way I see it.
So since you brought the issue of Maldives, what Maldives has done is to, try to play one against the other, China against India, to their better advantage. And similar observation has been made about the PIF countries. They want to have it all from all the sides. How, in the long run, is that a viable strategy to, pit US against China, or US and its allies against China? I mean, it's essentially US, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and possibly Japan on one side, on the other hand, it is China's creeping influence and deep pockets. Is it a viable strategy for PIF countries? And you know them very well because of your, study, research, visits. How long this will succeed? Will there be a time when they'll have to put a stop to this competitive, engagement with both the power blocks?
So it's difficult for me because I'm not in the they're different. When you talk about a country, it comes down to people, right? So and some of the decisions are made for the personal gain of the leadership, and sometimes they make it that sort of traditional elite capture, and sometimes there's very, like, for example, the Solomon Islands. I was there last summer, and I was with somebody who was ill, and so we went to the main hospital, and in in there were a lot of basic drugs that they just didn't have, and the hospital itself was in appalling shape. The doctors and nurses were some of the best I've seen, very dedicated, but the hospital was a disaster. And meanwhile, Australia had helped build an aquatic center for the Pacific Games. So if China has now said that they will build a big new wing for the hospital. And if if you have a sickly child, or a mother, or a sister who's pregnant, you'll do anything to make sure that she's going to be safe. So the lack of it, it's a failure from the world community that they are left with those choices. So I don't want to downplay that. I understand that. They don't have good choices in many cases. The other part of that, though, is that when China comes in, it doesn't come in like a normal country. And one of the big things that happens is it brings in a lot of organized crime. And that organized crime is the vector through which they gain control of the commercial sector and the political sector and all of these other things. And so that internal corruption ends up destroying families and destroying communities and destroying the environment and things. Not saying the U.S. has been perfect in any of these categories at all, but what we see China doing is off the charts. I mean, the fentanyl stuff it's a whole different category of things. So, you talk to people and they say, yeah, we know this is bad, but I need a hospital. My mom's going to die. And what do you do in those circumstances? I think what you do is you try to see who can give them better options, but until that starts to happen, China has its entry point, and then once it takes advantage of that entry point, it's parasitic. It can take over the country and corrode it from the inside in ways that are very difficult to recover from.
So what is the scale of Chinese investment in PIF nations?
Depends on the nation. And sometimes it's hard to track. So if you're looking at Solomon Islands, for example, the logging companies might pretend that, or might say they're Malaysian, but they're actually controlled by China. So it's kind of hard to track. And also the brute numbers may not be reflective of influence. If you have one business partnership with the right leader, that's more valuable in terms of influence than having huge investments otherwise. And a lot of the money is illicit. It's black market money, which also makes it hard to categorize. So that's why I have a bit of an issue when countries put out amounts of aid as a proxy for influence. You'll see this, you'll see the Australians saying, we're the biggest aid donor in the region. Well, if your aid is going for Australian consultants or an aquatic center, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah.
Like the life of the common person.
Yeah. But I have a question, sir. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So when you think about the region and its importance or not, what do you think about?
I think we'll discuss that.
Okay.
Some other observations. So we have been so far talking about US influence and US allies, and on the other hand, China. And that brings to mind, where is Russia in all this?
Yeah. So that's a good question. You see it popping up. You've seen it in the past, popping up in ways of that exhibit leverage, even through New Zealand. But that during the Soviet period. And it's funny because you're seeing it come back again in places like Kiribati, where it was active during the Soviet time. So the countries that have, in particular, some relationship with China, because there are 3 Pacific Island Forum countries that don't recognize China. 2 of the 3 that we mentioned before, Palau and Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. Those, because they don't have a Chinese embassy, they're somewhat insulated, because that means there's no kind of Chinese spy base open. The embassies function like forward operating bases for political influence operations. So you see less of the kind of ride along Russian stuff. But you do see some Russian stuff. It's just not as visible as what you see coming out of China. And the other thing is that, just by the by, if you have a Pacific-centered map, what you see is, we know there's enormous Chinese, Russian, and Iranian operations in Latin America. Well, to get from Russia, Iran, and China to Latin America, you go through the Pacific. So you're starting to see, in that context, definitely Chinese, but also Russian and Iranian, more transit through the Pacific Islands. But it's not, the big one is definitely by far issue is with China.
With China, not only comes the crime, overseas Chinese expatriates who settle there. What is the kind of estimate about Chinese expatriates in Pacific Island Forum countries? How many of them are there? Because they are the ones who then start, pulling the strings locally and run the crime syndicates.
Yeah, it really depends on the country. And in some places like French Polynesia, which is part of France, you have Chinese descent families that have been there for 6, 7 generations, very integrated. That's a whole different thing. And you see it in other parts as well. Sorry, but there are multiple different kinds of Chinese populations in the Pacific. So you'll have that kind, which have been there for a long time. Then you'll have the ones that are officially affiliated with the embassy. So those are kind of more visible. Then you'll have big business people who might be operating in more than one Pacific Island country. So they might be doing infrastructure, resource extraction, casinos or something in multiple countries. Then you have the small shop owners who may be working at a shop that's owned by one of the bigger business people. They might be only there for 5 or 7 years, try to make enough money, and then emigrate to Australia or New Zealand or something like that, rotate through. And then you have the ones that come in as labor on those Chinese infrastructure projects. So they're very different kinds of, and then of course there's the newly arrived Chinese community that might be coming in for different sorts of employment. But I'd say the vast majority fall into one of those categories. And in some cases you have countries where land ownership is very tricky, and so you'll see some intermarriage, which allows or in some cases they buy citizenship, which allows access to a whole different range of things. The criminal activity that you're talking about, I'll give you a case, a very specific case of the Kingdom of Tonga's first human trafficking case. Was a Chinese woman who brought in 2 other Chinese women to say they were going to work in a restaurant, and then forced them into prostitution, primarily to service the Chinese temporary workers. And one of them ended up getting assaulted, and so ended up in hospital. And that was how the Tongan authorities found out about the case. And it turned out that the woman who had brought them in was friends with the wife of the Chinese ambassador. And they had had some problems with translations in the court, because the court translator initially may not have been translating things accurately. But at this point, enough Tongans have spent time in China that they knew that it wasn't being translated accurately, and so a better translator came in. And ultimately the woman was their first human trafficking case. So that kind of crime, it runs through multiple layers of Chinese society, as the temporary workers, the local business owners, perhaps a linkage to officials. So it's hard. It's hard to quantify who owns that, except that you very rarely get collaboration from the Chinese embassy when a Chinese national commits a crime. So it's not necessarily a matter of size of the population. but it's often a matter of like just to finish this thing about Tonga is if a Chinese person goes to church, if they're a shop owner and they go to church, then they're less likely to be robbed by a Tongan than if they don't go to church. Because the Tongans don't see them as investing anything in the community, just coming and being parasitic. And so attacking or trying to rob the shop isn't necessarily, it's kind of almost seen as reciprocal, right? So I've given you a very long, complex answer to what should be a simple question, but numerical values are hard to get. And this again is I'm going to go back to Tonga because the law enforcement infrastructure isn't designed for this. And in the case of Tonga specifically, it's a long story, but Australia and New Zealand have imposed for many years now an Australian or New Zealander as police commissioner in Tonga. And that's been a real problem because the Tongan forces, who are very competent, don't like that sort of colonial setup. And it's not, I don't know about the current person, but in the past cases that I did know, they didn't speak Tongan. And so there's that flow of information has not been great. And they did have, when they had open problems with crime in the Chinese community, this was a while ago, I haven't tracked it recently, but what they did was they got a Chinese New Zealand police officer to come to Tonga to talk to the Chinese community in Tonga about what they could do better. So these systems, these systems are breaking down. The people of the countries don't have the trust or the power to be able to defend themselves. And the knee-jerk response from some of the bigger countries in the region, like Australia, is, well, we'll take over your security services. But if they don't understand the culture, the language, the operating environment, all they're going to do is create a lack of ability of the good local people to be able to take care of their own problems in an effective way. And and also to create a precedent. Like, for example, the reason there's the Australia New Zealand police commissioner is it was part of a tripartite agreement where they were given money. It's there were riots, complicated. But why can't the Chinese say, we'll give you 3 times as much for your police service and you'll put in a Chinese as your police commissioner? So the way Australia and New Zealand have been dealing with the region have created pathways that are, in some cases, barely post-colonial that the Chinese can ride right in on.
Well, what is happening that there was historical colonialism and there's creeping neo-economic colonialism from China. Both are colonialism at heart. China is no saint as far as colonialism goes. You talk to African nations that are indebted under BRI and are very, very bitter about Chinese experience. China does not put money anywhere unless it takes control of that country one way or the other. So you have 2 competing versions of colonialism, one the historical European colonialism, and this one is a creeping economic and probably maritime colonialism, because whenever China creates facts on grounds and then uses as historical precedent to say that this region is ours.
Yeah.
So you are seeing history being made.
Yeah, and I mean, When I met some Solomon Islanders who had been fighting for democracy in their country, and the meeting that had very much affected them when they came to Washington was meeting with Uyghurs, because the language that the Han Chinese told the Uyghurs was very similar to what they were being told. Oh, we're just here to help you with your development, you know. And then 10 years later, they're in concentration camps because they're not loyal enough to the Chinese Communist Party. So you don't even have to go to Africa. You could go to Tibet or go to, to see what's going to happen. The other thing that I would say that's kind of giving, there are a few things that have given me hope. One of them is that a lot more people from a lot of different countries, including Japan, but also India, are getting much more interested. You're starting to see the think tanks like NMF in India starting to have researchers that are looking at the region. And because of the experience of Asian countries or India, they can, just like you did, identify these dynamics very quickly and have a better toolkit in many cases for figuring out other alternatives.
So talking about India, India started a forum, I think, in 2014, PIPIC.
Yep.
Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation.
Yeah.
And I believe that there has been some sustained effort in developing some engagement with the Pacific Island Forum nations through this mechanism, just like India is engaging with Africa, India-Africa Summit, or Global South Summit. India has focused also on the Pacific Island Forum nations. And Prime Minister Modi's visit to Papua New Guinea, when the president of Papua New Guinea almost, bent down and touched Prime Minister Modi's feet, and thanked him for providing vaccines during the Wuhan virus pandemic, when no one was coming to their benefit. So India's engagement has started in the region. The thing is that India is a non-colonizing country, and their model is slightly different from whether the Western colonialism or Chinese colonialism. So the engagement is more in the form of capacity building, training professionals, creating infrastructure, but more as grant in aid rather than any hard loans or exploitative, takeovers of the real estate for non-payment of compound rate loans. So there has been some interest, and as India's profile is rising internationally, they are looking at the consequence or potential consequences of giving, clear way to China to exploit every part of the world, because Chinese designs are not to be commented upon. Whatever they say, they never mean it, and totally opposite happens. So India has understood that. That's why India is not going to neglect this region, but India has limitations.
Yeah. So I think that India is not China, obviously. So one of the things that would be great to see is if the Indian business community had an easier pathway to come into the region. MEA doesn't have to do everything. And in many cases, what the people of the region want is just better options. They want to, if you're going to go to medical school, Australia and New Zealand, it's too expensive for you, for many people. And going to China means you're going to have to learn Chinese. And, so, however, India has excellent healthcare. It's just a matter, including healthcare training. It's just a matter of being able to get there. So things like and one thing Prime Minister Modi did right at the beginning of that first trip to the Pacific was allow for visa on arrivals, very easy visa access for Pacific Islanders. And that was psychologically very important. It was a symbol of trust. You know, you are welcome to India. But the problem is getting to India is difficult. And in many cases, especially if you're from the South, you might have to go through Australia or New Zealand. And those countries require, even for transit in many cases, onerous visa application processes. So if you started to get direct flights, you know, from India, maybe to stop in PNG or Solomons or Fiji even, and then go back. And then, you know, those embassies or high commissions help the Indian business community figure out how to engage in those economies and unleash all of that potential. Then I think that you could really, it would be appreciated. Like, for example, telecoms or telehealth or pharmaceuticals or, you know, kind of village scale economics or water purification, or like they're just the climate is similar and the challenges are similar to what you see, especially in southern India.
I think you are right that there has to be some people to people and business to business cooperation also besides G to G activities. But on G2G activities, as I said, India is very recent in engaging the region since 2014. Colonial powers have been there forever, like 300 years, and China also has been there for a while now. So India is the latest, entrant to this region, engaging the entire region. Though sparsely populated, it has some maritime, significance. But where I would hope that MEA does something is to appoint an ambassador at large to PIF.
It's a good idea. Yeah.
I mean, to engage all the 19 countries, because otherwise it becomes very difficult. Mm-hmm. The other thing that could be done on the MEA's part is to have a permanent secretariat of FIPIC, let's say in island of Fiji. That those are the mechanisms by which you deepen the engagement. Yes, there's a role for other players, and of course, in India at this point in time, with the election being there, nobody is going to talk about Indian businesses should sort of invest in PIF countries, because politicians will say, oh, they are in the pockets of business tycoons and things like that. But yes, there will be a role, as Indian businesses have been investing in other regional countries, at least in Indian Ocean region. There are mechanisms, in Indian Ocean littoral states, India is engaging. So my hope is that FIPIC will become a much stronger institution. And as India's philosophy of being friend of the world, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and Vishwamitra, friend of the entire world, that region cannot be neglected. And my hope is that in future years to come, there will be much more deeper and much more focused engagement. Because not engaging means, let this become another Chinese private lake, South Pacific.
And it affects the entry point into the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
But and also, there's India might want to explore more. It has some, but explore more the use of honorary consuls, so that you have people in country who can attend all of those diplomatic events, because you're not going to set up embassies everywhere, but somebody who's a point of contact. So if a Indian business or educational institution or whatever wants to know who's who in the country, you have your honorary Indian consul. Yeah. The other thing is that because below the equator and above the equator are very different, and because of that defense and U.S. defense and security construct that includes Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, but also Guam, the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas. All of that area, with the exception of Guam, actually belonged to Japan from 1914 to 1944 until they lost it in the war to the U.S. And there's very strong Japanese ties there. And it's a primary operations zone potentially for India, Japan, U.S., maybe India, Japan, Korea operations, maybe something with Taiwan, possibly the Quad. So I think it might make sense to have, yes, you could have a centralized thing for the Southern Pacific, but to have the other one centralized out of the Japanese embassy, the Indian Japanese embassy. So cover Palau, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia at the least, possibly Kiribati and Nauru, but definitely those three out of Japan. And it would help coordinate better with Japanese defense and U.S. defense on activities in that region. For the reason that you started off our conversation with, which is that the Chinese are pushing up against that first island chain, and that across the middle Central Pacific is essential to reinforce that. So from an Indian security perspective, you've got China potentially, coming down from the Himalayas, but if it's going to break out of that first island chain and then be in a position to come around, you want to make sure that U.S. can reinforce. So a few very good Indian defense minds, and we both know a few of those, sitting in Tokyo or advising from there, and keeping an eye on what's happening with those Central Pacific or West Pacific islands might be more helpful.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Cleo. This is your first appearance on our platform.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This would not be the last. I'll pester you for further engagement with our platform. And it was a pleasure to talk about a topic nobody wants to talk about. Somehow, with Ukraine and West Asia and Russia, what is happening, I think the problems you were enumerating about the US Congress, not being able to pay attention, I think it's just a byproduct of that process, that equally important, but not so kind of exotic or not so topical issues sometimes are neglected. And then one regrets later on, why didn't we see what is happening there?
Yeah.
So pleasure to have you.
Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to cover this odd little topic before it's too late.
Yes, before it is too late. And that is where there's importance of foresight and kind of wisdom to prevent things that are happening in South Champa Sea or West Philippine Sea. I don't want to use a different
ASEAN Sea. I've heard it could be called the ASEAN Sea.
Well, different names depending upon whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
It's certainly not South China Sea.
Certainly not.
No. Thank you very much indeed, Cleo.
Thank you, sir.
We shall stay in touch.
Please.